The young man in the paint-stained hoodie had been standing outside the Hargrave Club on a Tuesday evening in November for close to 30 minutes, his breath making small clouds against the glass. Inside, the light was amber and warm. Long tables ran the length of a dining room that smelled of cedar and roasted meat. At the far end, where the lighting dropped lower, a dozen men sat around a table covered in green felt, their cards held close, their voices low. One of them laughed at something, and the sound carried through the glass like something meant to travel only so far. The young man's name was Kofi Asante. He was 20 years old, and he had not eaten since the morning before. He had walked 2.5 kilometers in November cold to get here, which was not a long walk for a person with good boots. Kofi's boots had a crack in the left sole that let the wet in. His feet had stopped feeling like his feet somewhere past the overpass on Main Street. He had the address written on his phone, the battery at 4%, the screen cracking from the corner the way a phone cracks when it has been dropped once too often by a person who cannot afford to be careful with things. He pushed the door open before he could think it through. The Hargrave Club had been a private dining and card room for 40 years. The ceilings were pressed tin, painted cream, and the floors were dark-stained sheet hardwood that had been refinished so many times the wood had gone soft at the edges near the walls. The men at the card table were the kind of men who had been coming here since before Kofi was born, which was to say they were the kind of men who did not expect the door to open on a Tuesday in November and admit someone who looked the way Kofi looked. The conversations did not stop all at once. They went the way a fire goes when you pull the wood out one piece at a time, until there was nothing left but the sound of the record player in the corner, finishing a song nobody had been listening to. Kofi stood on the hardwood, with snow melting off his sleeves. His hoodie had been his uncle's before it was his. His hands were bare because he had lost one glove somewhere on the walk and had decided at some point it was not worth going back for. A man at the center of the card table leaned back in his chair. He was broad across the chest, with close-cropped silver hair and a shirt that had been ironed by someone who ironed shirts for a living. He looked at Kofi the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to deal with or ignore. He decided on something worse than either. "Son," he said, loud enough for the room, "did you take a wrong turn somewhere?" A few men laughed, not all of them. The man to his left, younger, kept his eyes on his cards. The woman behind the bar, who had been polishing glasses with the careful attention of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible in rooms like this one, set the glass down very gently. Kofi swallowed. He had practiced this moment in his head for 6 blocks. "I play cards," he said. "Poker. I heard there was a game here on Tuesdays." He stopped. He made himself say the rest of it. "I don't have any money for the buy-in. I was wondering if there was another way in." The silence that came after was a specific kind of silence. The kind that means the room has decided something about you before you have finished your sentence. The silver-haired man smiled. It was not an unkind smile, which made it worse. "You play cards?" "Yes." "What's your name, son?" "Kofi Asante." The man looked around the table, inviting the room into the joke. "Well, Mr. Asante, what did you have in mind? You going to deal us a hand in exchange for what, exactly? A hot meal?" "Yes," Kofi said. "That's exactly what I had in mind." The laughter was louder this time. The man at the bar did not laugh. He was looking at Kofi with an expression Kofi recognized without being able to name, the expression of someone who has been in this room long enough to know exactly what it costs to stand where Kofi was standing. "All right," the silver-haired man said. He was already performing for the room, already making an event of it. "Sit down, Mr. Asante. Show us what you've got." "If you can take a hand off me, Dale Coburn, in front of these gentlemen, I'll buy you whatever's left in the kitchen." He said it the way men say things when they are sure nothing is going to happen. Kofi crossed the room. He sat down in the empty chair across from Dale Coburn, and he put his hands flat on the green felt to keep them still. His fingernails were clean. He had made sure of that before he left the shelter that afternoon. The cards were dealt. 5-card draw, the way Coburn liked it, the way Coburn had been winning at for 30 years. Kofi picked up his hand. He had learned to read a table before he had learned to read the cards on it. He had learned that in his grandmother's kitchen in Brampton when he was 8 years old, watching her play bid whist with her friends on Sunday afternoons after church. The table talk, the way a person arranged their hand, the small habits they didn't know they had, the quick glance at the top left when the cards were good, the stillness when they weren't, the way a man like Coburn had been winning for so long that he had stopped noticing he had tells at all. Kofi noticed. He did not win the first hand. He did not try to win the first hand. He was watching. Coburn took the pot easily and looked satisfied in the way of a man who had expected nothing less. "Still with us?" he said to Kofi. "I'm still here." The second hand. Kofi folded early and watched Coburn's left thumb move across his chips twice when he had something and once when he didn't. He watched the man to Coburn's right pull at his collar in the specific way he did when he was bluffing, not because he was nervous, but because the collar had grown slightly too tight in the last few years and the habit had set in before he noticed. The third hand, Kofi played. He played it quietly. No drama, no tells that weren't deliberate. He raised once calmly. The man with the tight collar folded. The man to Coburn's left folded. And Coburn, who had a pair of kings and had had a pair of kings for 20 minutes of his face, called. Kofi laid down 3 tens. The table went still. Coburn stared at the cards. He looked at Kofi. He looked at the cards again. "Beginner's luck," said someone near the window, though his voice had the sound of a man trying to convince himself. "Deal again," Coburn said. They dealt again. Kofi won that hand too, and the one after it. The room, which had been leaning back in its chairs, began to lean forward. Coburn's jaw had tightened in a way that had nothing to do with concentration and everything to do with something he was not ready to put a name to. By the 7th hand, men who had been sitting at other tables had drifted closer without appearing to have moved at all. On the 8th hand, Kofi set down a full house, queens over 7s, and looked up from the cards for the first time since the game had started. The room was quiet, not the same quiet as when he had walked in. That had been the quiet of a door swinging shut. This was the quiet of a room recalibrating, trying to fit something new into the space it had already decided was full. Coburn sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "My grandmother," Kofi said. "Your grandmother. She played cards every Sunday for 60 years. She said a card table will tell you everything about a person if you're patient enough to listen." Coburn looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Then he stood and buttoned his jacket with the careful movements of a man performing composure, and he walked toward the back of the room without collecting his jacket from the chair. The man behind the bar, whose name was Leo, came around the counter with a plate. He set it down in front of Kofi without fanfare. A bowl of beef barley soup, 2 thick slices of bread, butter still in its foil wrapper. He did not look at Coburn. He did not look at anyone in the room except Kofi. "On me," Leo said quietly. The kitchen was about to close anyway. Kofi looked at the soup. Something happened in his chest that he was not going to examine too closely, not here, not in front of these men. He picked up the spoon. He ate slowly, the way his grandmother had always told him to eat when someone put food in front of you for free. "Take your time," she used to say. "Rushing makes you look grateful. Grateful puts you in debt. Take your time and eat like you belong at the table." He ate like he belonged at the table. Nobody said anything. The fire in the corner of the room had burned down to a low pulse of orange. Outside, November kept doing what November does on the prairies. It was a woman near the window who moved next. She had been sitting apart from the card table the entire evening, nursing a glass of something amber, watching with the particular attention of someone who has stopped pretending to read the book open in her lap. She was older, 60 or so, with white hair cut close, and the kind of posture that does not come from a good family so much as from a life spent making decisions that matter. She came over to his table without hurrying. "My name is Vivienne Marsh," she said. "I'm on the board of directors here, and I want to apologize for what this room did when you walked in." Kofi looked up at her. Her eyes were not soft. They were direct, which he found easier to take than soft. "You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. That's why I'm doing it." She sat down across from him without being invited. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" He did not answer right away. "There's a guest room upstairs," she said. "It's kept for speakers we host, visiting members from out of town. It has a lock on the inside. I can ask Leo to open it." She paused. "I'm not making an offer on behalf of the club. I'm making it on behalf of myself. You can say no." Kofi looked at the bread in his hand. He thought about the shelter on Portage Avenue, the bottom bunk, the sound of 20 men trying to sleep in the same room. He thought about what his grandmother used to say about accepting help from strangers. You take help when it's offered clean. You learn to tell the difference. He looked at Vivian Marsh. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Because my son would have done the same thing you did tonight," she said. "Walked in like that, said his piece, played his game. He had that kind of nerve." She was quiet for a second. "He passed away 4 years ago. He was 23. She put her hands on the table and stood up. "The room upstairs has a window that faces east. I find that matters in November." She walked to the manager's office without waiting for his answer, and Kofi sat with the soup getting warm in his chest and the bread still in his hand and did not know what to do with any of it. He stayed. He woke the next morning in a bed for the first time in 11 days. The room faced east, the way Vivian had said. Gray November light came through the curtains. The mattress was firm. On the chair beside the door he had draped his hoodie, and it had dried overnight for the first time in a week. He lay still for a long time, figuring out where he was. He had brought very little with him. The clothes on his back, his phone on 4%, a battered deck of cards wrapped in an elastic band that he had carried since he was 12 years old. His grandmother had given it to him the Christmas before her eyesight started to go. The cards were soft with use, their edges worn, the back design faded in the 2 bottom corners of each card from the particular way she had always held her hand. He took the deck out in the morning and held it for a while before he went downstairs. The club was already open when he came down at 8:30. Word had traveled in the way. Word travels in rooms like this one, selectively, and with an angle. 3 men he had not seen the night before were gathered near the fireplace in their coats, the way men stand when they have come somewhere specifically to form an opinion. One of them stepped forward before Kofi had reached the bottom of the stairs. "David Marsh," the man said. "Vivian's brother-in-law, I heard about last night." He smiled in the way of someone who has already decided the expression they are going to wear. "Quite a performance." "It wasn't a performance," Kofi said. "Of course not." The smile did not move. "The thing is, a few of us reviewed the hands this morning with some of the men who were here, and there are a few questions." He tilted his head. "Dale Coburn is a careful player. He's been playing at this table for 30 years. The odds of a first-timer reading him like that." "I watched 3 hands before I played," Kofi said. "Right, 3 hands." David Marsh looked at the men by the fireplace. "And before that, where did you play before this?" "Kitchens, church basements, wherever my grandmother played." David Marsh nodded, the nod of a man who is performing patience. "Here's the thing, Mr. Asante. Some of us are concerned that what we saw last night wasn't natural talent so much as a prepared routine, a specific read on a specific player, something you might have, let's say, researched before coming in." Kofi looked at him. He had nothing to say to that, and David Marsh had expected something to say back, and the absence of it made the air between them go slightly strange. "I didn't research anyone," Kofi said. "I read the table." David Marsh looked at the men by the fireplace. One of them nodded. Marsh turned back. "We'll see," he said, and returned to the fireplace. Leo was behind the bar. He had been polishing the same section of counter for the last 5 minutes. He looked at Kofi and gave the smallest possible lift of his chin in the direction of a small table near the window, where Vivian Marsh was sitting with a cup of coffee. Kofi went to her. She did not look up from her cup, but she pushed a second one across the table before he sat down. "David," she said. "Not a question. He thinks I set something up in advance. David has been coming to this club for 22 years, she said. In that time, he has lost a significant amount of money at that table and developed significant theories about why. None of those theories have ever involved his own play." She lifted her cup. "Don't let him put you off your game. Drink the coffee." He drank the coffee. "There will be someone here this afternoon," she said. "His name is Frank Obi. He runs a card room on Osborne Street, legitimate, licensed, the only room in the city where the serious players go. He was told about last night. He'll want to sit across from you. She set her cup down. Coburn arranged it. What's the wager? Same as last night. A meal. Possibly more, though no one will say that out loud. She looked at him directly. Frank Obie is not Coburn. He doesn't have tells. He has levels, and by the time you think you've found the bottom one, there's another underneath. Don't play the cards. Play the room. She went back to her coffee. She did not look at him again, and he understood that she was not doing it to be cold. She was doing it so that the room would not see her as his protector, and so he would not be seen as needing one. He drank the rest of the coffee slowly. Frank Obie arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with a quiet way of entering a room that managed to make everyone in it immediately aware that he had entered. He nodded at Vivienne, shook hands with Coburn, and looked at Kofi the way a person looks at something they have heard described and are now deciding whether the description was accurate. He sat down across from Kofi. I heard you played well last night, he said. He had a mild Manitoba accent layered under something else. I had a good night, Kofi said. Let's see if you can have 2 of them. He extended a closed fist across the table and opened it on a red chip. You choose the game. Kofi thought for a moment. 7-card stud, he said. Frank Obie's expression did not change, but he blinked once, and the blink was half a second longer than the blinks before it. 7-card stud was his grandmother's game. They played. It was not like the night before. Coburn had been a wall. Frank Obie was a corridor, and the further Kofi walked down it, the more turns it made. He played layers. He built stories out of his betting patterns, chapter by chapter, and then in the final round he closed the book and opened a different one. And the 2 books had nothing to do with each other. Kofi had heard his grandmother describe this kind of player once, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea, talking about a woman she'd played against at a church social in Mississauga 30 years earlier. She called it floating. They float on top of the game, she had said, so that whatever's underneath can't be seen. But if you watch long enough, you can see the wake. The water doesn't lie even when the person does. By the 5th hand, Kofi was watching the wake. He did not take it apart dramatically. He did not make a move that ended the game in a single moment. He pressed one small decision at a time, slowly, the way you take a knot apart when you can't afford to damage the string. On the 9th hand, Frank Obie had a flush that should have taken the pot, and Kofi's full house sat across from it in the quiet way of something that did not need to announce itself. Frank Obie looked at the cards for a long time. Then he looked at Kofi. Your grandmother, he said. Yes, she taught you the wake. Kofi blinked. That's what she called it. Frank Obie was quiet for a moment. Then he put out his hand across the green felt. My mother used that word, he said. She was from Kingston. She said you watched the water, not the boat. He paused. How long have you been without a place to stay? 11 days, Kofi said, and did not know until he had said it out loud how much weight those 2 words carried. Frank Obie released his hand. He sat back. He looked across the room in the way of a man who is doing arithmetic. I have a room above the card room on Osborne Street, he said. It's been empty since September. It's not a gift. If you want it, you work 3 nights a week, door and floor management. He looked at Kofi. I'm not doing this because of last night. I'm doing it because you play the wake, and I have not met anyone under 40 who knows what that means. And because my mother would have wanted someone to. The room had been listening. Some of it had the grace to pretend otherwise. Kofi said, yes. He said it simply, without performance, the way his grandmother had always told him to accept things that were real. That was Thursday. Friday, he moved his few things from the shelter on Portage into the room on Osborne Street. It was small, with a window that looked onto an alley and a radiator that knocked in the night. It smelled of old wood and the particular kind of clean that comes from a place that has been unoccupied long enough to forget what it smelled like before. He set the deck of cards on the windowsill with the faded corners facing out, the way he had always kept it, the way his grandmother had kept it before him. Saturday morning came with freezing rain. He was back at the Hargrave Club at 9 because Vivienne had asked him to come, And because he had learned in a week to trust the particular way she said things she meant. The room was full. He did not know what had happened between Thursday and Saturday. Later, Leo would tell him that a video had been taken on someone's phone during the game with Obi, had gone to 2 people and then 12 and then more, the way things move in a city that is smaller than it tells itself. By Saturday morning, 3 local journalists had called the club's front desk. The manager had stopped answering. He found out the rest of it by accident. He had come up from the dining room Saturday evening, a plate of food in his hands, heading for the stairs, when he heard voices in the small meeting room off the upper landing. The door had not quite caught. He slowed because he heard his own name. He knew he should keep walking. He stood in the hallway and heard Dale Coburn's voice first. "The story is already out there," Coburn was saying. "The video has 10,000 views and it's been 12 hours. After what happened with the licensing review in February and the noise we got from that piece in the Free Press, this could not have come at a better time. The narrative practically writes itself." A second voice, one Kofi did not recognize. "So we lean into it. Young man from nothing walks in, beats our best player, we take him under the club's wing." "That's the whole press release. The whole thing," Coburn said. "Giselle on communications has already drafted the statement. We lead with the club's commitment to community access. The licensing file gets buried under the goodwill before the review board reconvenes in January." A third voice, quieter than the others. "And the young man gets a platform. He gets visibility. It isn't nothing." Kofi recognized the third voice. He had been hearing it for 4 days and had begun to trust it in the cautious way of a person who has been wrong about trust before. "It isn't nothing," Vivian Marsh said from inside the closed room. The plate was cold in Kofi's hands. He stood in the upper hallway outside the meeting room for what might have been 20 seconds or might have been 2 minutes. He heard the voices continue behind the door. He did not hear them anymore. He heard instead the sound of his grandmother's kitchen, the smell of tea, the particular way she had of looking at him when he came home from somewhere, and she could tell without asking that something had gone wrong. "You know who you are before you walk into any room," she used to say. "You know it when you walk in and you know it when you walk out. The room doesn't change it." He went back downstairs slowly. He did not go to the dining room. He went to the room above the card room on Osborne Street, set the plate down on the windowsill next to the deck of cards, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then he took his hoodie off the chair, put it on, zipped it to the throat, picked up the backpack, and went down the stairs and out into the freezing rain. He walked. By Sunday morning, the room above the card room was empty. The plate was still on the windowsill. The deck of cards was gone. Leo found out first. He had gone to the club at 7 to prep for the morning service, the way he went every Sunday, and something about the way the room looked when he came in told him what he needed to know before anyone said anything. He called Frank Obi at 8. Obi was at the club by 9. He found Vivian in the dining room, sitting at her usual table with her coat still on. She was looking at the empty chair across from her where Kofi had drunk coffee 3 mornings in a row. "He heard us," she said when Obi sat down. "When?" "Saturday evening. The meeting room upstairs. The door." She looked at her hands. "He was bringing his dinner up." Obi sat back. He did not say anything for a moment. "What did you say in that room?" he asked. Vivian was quiet for long enough that the answer was already clear. "I said it wasn't nothing," she said. "What he'd get from the press release. I said it like that was an argument." She folded her hands on the table. "I knew what the press release was for. I said it anyway." She picked up the phone and called Frank Obi's cell, and then she remembered he was sitting across from her and set the phone back down. "I know where he is," she said. "The North End Library opened at 10 on Sundays. It was a small branch in a converted building on Salter Street, warm in the particular bone-deep way of underfunded public buildings that compensate with good radiators. The librarian at the front desk had dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked up when the door opened. "I'm looking for a young man," Vivian said. She was still in her coat, still wearing the pearl earrings she'd put on for Saturday dinner 2 nights ago. There was dried salt on her boots from the freezing rain. He would have come in this morning. He'd have a deck of cards with him. The librarian looked at her for a moment. "Reading room," she said. "Second floor. He's been at the window table since we opened. I didn't reshelve his book because I figured he was coming back to it." Vivienne climbed the stairs. Her knees had been telling her things since August that she was not ready to agree with. The reading room was quiet and warm and nearly empty. A teenage boy had his headphones on at the long table. An older woman dozed in the armchair by the shelf. Near the south window, with his back to the door, Kofi Asante sat at a small table with his grandmother's deck spread across the wood in front of him. The cards is laid out in a patience game he was playing without urgency. The light from the window came in flat and gray and fell across his hands. Vivienne stood in the doorway and watched him. She watched the particular way he turned a card, the small pause before he placed it, the way his lips moved slightly through whatever he was thinking. She watched him be a person she had spent 5 days looking at without fully seeing. Inside Kofi's head, the kitchen in Brampton had come back. His grandmother at the table, the last autumn, her hands a little slower on the cards than they used to be, her eyes not tracking the way they had when he was small. The deck between them on the good tablecloth she only brought out for company and for card games, the tea going cold. "Kofi," she had said. "You listening?" "Yes, Nana. The day's going to come when somebody offers you something big, something you need real bad, and it's going to come wrapped up in something that's partly about you and partly not. And you're going to have to decide which part you're going to take home with you." He had been 16. He had not known what she was talking about. He knew what she was talking about now. "Don't play for their story," she had said, setting a card down with the careful deliberateness of someone making a point with a gesture instead of a word. "You play because you deserve to be at the table. You play on your own terms or you don't play." She had looked up at him over the fanned edge of her hand. "Promise me." "I promise, Nana," her thumb on the worn edge of the faded card. The kitchen smell of tea and something stewing on the back burner. Walk far enough in your own direction and the door opens by itself. The reading room came back. Kofi set down a card. He left his hand on the table. He had known Vivienne was in the doorway for a minute before he turned to look at her. She was standing at the entrance without a coat, because her coat was still in the room on Osborne Street, on the chair where she'd left it. And November had followed her here through the freezing rain, and her hair was damp, and her earrings were the same ones from 2 nights ago, and she looked exactly like a woman who had come somewhere without thinking through what she was going to say when she got there. She walked across to his table. She did not sit. "I'm not here to bring you back," she said. He did not answer. "I'm not here with an offer or a statement or a press release." Her voice was steady. "I'm here because of what I said in that room. I knew what we were building in there, and I said my piece and let it keep being built, and then I went home and I did not sleep, and I am here now because I cannot tell you what I know about my son and ask you to trust me and then be that person in that room. Those two things cannot both be true at once." She stopped. "I'm not apologizing so you'll come back. I'm apologizing because you deserved better than that from someone who knew better." She turned to go. "Vivienne," he said. She turned back. He looked at the cards in front of him. He looked at the worn edges of the deck, the 2 faded corners, the way the light came off them in the flat November gray. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Frank Obie came at noon and sat at the far end of the reading room and did not interrupt. Leo brought sandwiches from somewhere and left them at the door of the reading room without coming in. Kofi wrote his terms on a piece of paper the librarian gave him, a single sheet from a yellow legal pad that she produced without comment, and then went back to her desk. His terms were not long. There would be a mentorship program. It would operate out of Frank Obie's card room on Osborne Street 3 evenings a week, open to any young person from any neighborhood in the city who wanted to learn. The cost of entry would be nothing. The program would be funded by a combination of the Hargrave Club's Community Foundation and a private contribution from Dale Coburn personally, which Vivienne indicated when she read that line she would see to. The program would be named for his grandmother. Her name was Eunice Asante. She had come to Brampton from Accra in 1974, had played cards in every church basement and community room that would have her for 45 years, and had taught every grandchild she had that a card table is the most honest room in the world, because the cards do not know who you are, only what you do. Kofi himself would accept a sponsored entry into the Manitoba Poker Championship in February. He would not accept a stipend. He would not accept housing. The room on Osborne Street he would keep because it was a working arrangement, and he had shaken Frank Obi's hand, and he did not undo handshakes. He would not be photographed for any club promotion, ever. He brought the terms to the Hargrave Club on Tuesday evening, 6 days after the night he had first walked in. The board voted by a margin that Vivienne told him later was not as close as she'd expected and not as lopsided as she'd hoped. Coburn voted yes, which surprised some people and did not surprise others. David Marsh voted no. 3 others voted no. The rest voted yes. Kofi was not in the room for the vote. He was downstairs with Leo, who had made soup without being asked, and they ate in the kitchen and did not talk about it. And when Vivienne came down and nodded at him from the doorway, Leo poured 3 cups of coffee, and they sat at the prep counter together, while November pressed against the kitchen window. The Manitoba Poker Championship was held in February in a conference center 2 blocks from the Forks. The tables were set under fluorescent lights that hummed slightly in the base registers, and the room smelled of coffee and the particular tension of 100 people trying to look like they were not nervous. Kofi sat down at his table in a gray wool sweater Vivienne had given him for the occasion and dark pants he had found at a church sale on Notre Dame Avenue. He had the deck of cards in the pocket of his jacket, but he did not take them out. He looked up at the spectator section once, before the cards were dealt. Frank Obi was there. Vivienne beside him, her coat on this time, her pearl earrings in. Leo on the aisle in a jacket that belonged to someone else and fit him accordingly. He had asked for the Sunday off from the club for the first time in 7 years. Kofi did not look for David Marsh. He already knew he would not find him. He looked at the table in front of him, and he felt, for the first time since November, something unclenching in his chest. The thing that had been braced since the shelter on Portage Avenue, since the walk in cracked boots, since the door of the Hargrave Club, and the laughter that had followed him across the marble. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the worn edges of the deck on the table in Brampton, the Sunday afternoons, the way she had held her hand with the 2 fingers, slightly crooked, that he had never been able to copy right, and the way she had watched other players across the table with the calm attention of someone who is not trying to win something, so much as trying to understand it. "You watch the water," she used to say. Not the boat. He watched the water. 87 players entered the championship. The field narrowed across 2 days in the patient, almost geological way that serious poker narrows, 1 player at a time, at different speeds, until what was left were 9 at the final table, and then 3, and then 2. The player across from Kofi at the end was a woman from Winnipeg named Christine, 41 years old, who had been playing competitive poker since she was 19 and had a way of sitting at a table that made you feel like the table was hers and you were visiting. She shook Kofi's hand before the final hand with the focused, even courtesy of someone who competes because they love it and wins because they love it more. The hand lasted 11 minutes. It was not dramatic in the way people expect these things to be dramatic. It was slow and deliberate and full of small, true decisions on both sides. And at the end of it, Kofi pushed all of his chips to the center of the table with a straight flush, 9 to king. And Christine looked at her 2 pair and looked at the chips and nodded once. "Good game," she said, and extended her hand. He took it. The hall stood. The lights were very bright. Kofi sat in the chair for a moment before he stood up. He looked at the chips in the center of the table. He looked at his hands. He took his grandmother's deck out of his jacket pocket and set it on the table next to the tournament chips. The faded corners, the worn backs, the particular softness of 60 years of Sunday afternoons. He sat there for a while. Vivienne came up behind him. She put her hand on the back of his chair, not on his shoulder, the way she had learned to do it. She stood there for a moment, and then she went back to where Frank Obi and Leo were waiting. and she left him alone because she had learned when to do that. When the room had mostly cleared and the staff had started breaking down the tables, Kofi picked up his grandmother's deck, wrapped the elastic around it, and slid it into his jacket pocket. He shouldered his bag. He walked out through the emptying hall. Outside, February in Winnipeg was doing what February in Winnipeg does, honest and unrelenting and not interested in your feelings about it. He stood on the sidewalk and felt the cold on his face and breathed out a long, slow breath that showed white against the dark. Behind him, on the wall of the conference center lobby, a small brass plaque had been installed that morning. It had been Frank Obi's idea, and Vivienne had made the call, and the Hargrave Club had paid for it, which had been one of Kofi's conditions, and also one of the conditions nobody had argued with. The plaque read, "In memory of Eunice Asante, 1946-2022. She taught us that the cards don't know who you are, only what you do." Kofi did not see the plaque that night. He found out about it later, from Leo, who had photographed it on his phone before the ceremony and sent it to Kofi at 11 that evening with no message, only the image. Kofi looked at it for a long time. Then he set his phone face down on the table beside the deck of cards, and he sat in the room on Osborne Street with the radiator knocking quietly in the corner. And he did not try to do anything about the feeling in his chest. He just let it be there. He had learned in the last 3 months that some things do not need to be played. Some things you just hold, the way you hold a hand you know is good, quietly, without showing it to anyone, until the moment is right. The moment was not right yet, but he was at the table, and the cards were his grandmother's, and he was not going anywhere.